Water, be it in the sea or inland, has always been an irresistible magnet to life, humans included. Within living memory, the Norfolk Broad supported a network of rural industries as well as of rich wildlife. Now the trading boats have been replaced by pleasure cruisers. Another watery paradise, the Cornish coast, has also been transformed by tourism. Local men still fish, but like the rural workers in the Broads, they stand out as a dwindling exception in a sea of holidaymakers. Broadland is a prospect of vast skies and flat, empty marshes, but it wasn't always like this. Once the region was a honeycomb of industry. The Broads themselves were peat mines, abandoned when the sea level rose and flooded the diggings 7 centuries ago. In time, the area became a haven for fishermen, messers about in boats and reed cutters. Now the residents are mostly people enthralled to the watery spirit of the place, like Keith MacDougall of Catfield Broad.
I spent my boyhood here, right in the middle of the Ant Valley, in the Norfolk Broads, and it's rather a special place. I've known it all my life. And behind me here, you'll see my family home, where I was brought up, and I spent all my childhood. And over here, of course, you see all the water and the fens, where I spent hours paddling about in canoes, looking at the wildlife.
Half of East Anglia was like this once, an immense waste of wetland plants and animals. And as the fens were drained, Broadland became the last refuge for species like the crane and the otter. It was an amphibious paradise. Even the Broadlanders themselves sometimes strode about the marshes on stilts, like wading birds. Broadland was, and still is in many places, a checkerboard of different habitats, from tidal marshes to the wet woodland known as Carr. And its human inhabitants are just as tangily individual.
Broadland is not just the water of the Broads. It's a whole environmental area. The marshes, the alder cars, the reed beds. Without those, Broadland would be nothing. Brighton, of course, is salt water, and it is right up to Hadley Cross. So you've got not only fresh water in the Broads, you've got salt water in the Broads, and it gives you a variance of wildlife.
In the southwest of Britain, the people living on the Cornish coast have also led lives inextricably linked with water.
Through the centuries, the men of Cornwall have shaped their own history, proudly independent of their English neighbours, speaking their own language, handing down their own customs and culture. For Cornwall is almost an island. On 2 sides, her rocky cliffs face the Atlantic rollers. To the east, the River Tamar almost cuts her off from England beyond.
It isn't just geography that gives Cornwall an island feel. It has an island culture, quirky, self-sufficient when it can be, and with an inborn habit of turning its face towards the sea.
Morning, Eamon.
Hello.
Having your haircut then?
Do yours if you like.
Yeah, okay then. A Mohegan, please. You see all these meadows a few years ago were planted in violets and daffodils, and they've grown, now they're disused and they've all grown in, and the same with all that hill over there.
What has been reclaimed by nature along parts of this coast is the kind of field system once common in small fishing communities. Small plots tended by fishermen in the off-season or when the weather was too bad to go out to sea. In Cornwall's mild climate, many of them were given over to the growing of early spring flowers, daffodils especially. Now cut flower growing is part of the agriculture industry, and one more enterprise that worked on a human scale has been weeded out. But at least the old plots have made new room for Cornwall's native wildlife.
I suppose my earliest memories must be in the beginning of the 30s. I was staying down here on holiday. I used to rather like being on my own, and I used to head out from Polesworth and come out here and just watch the sea. In the old days, we used to come to Cornwall pretty well every year, and it was always a massive excitement in those days as a kid. It was a very slow journey on. We changed trains and messed around. It took hours to get actually to Lancing. Then in the evening, we would proceed to Polesworth by car coming across East Downs. Now that was always a great thing. I used to love that. It's because it was covered with gypsies in the old days. You would come past gypsy fires, gypsy caravans, washing lines. We used to call them diddy-coys. We were always sort of warned, you know, they were rough people, you shouldn't really talk to them. But it was fascinating. I was always intrigued by them.
Norfolk, too, was full of romance and excitement for young explorers.
I was about 5 or 6 when I moved to Norfolk. But I still have very vivid memories of my first days, my first weeks, my first years in Norfolk. It was a place full of mystery. It was undiscovered. It was exciting. There was all sorts of things for a young boy to get involved in. The place was full of wildlife and birds and butterflies, and I couldn't wait to get out there. I always felt I was rather like Tom Sawyer, exploring the wetlands of the Mississippi. There were places here which I honestly felt nobody had ever been to before. I always felt that the reed is the most beautiful plant in the world. It's a very gentle, elegant plant, and it changes according to the time of the year. To sail along the stretch of the Broads, perhaps late autumn, and to see the golden colour of the reed reflected in the water is a very beautiful sight.
When you get sun on reed, it always lights up. It gives that lovely colour. And I have a great love for marshes. This is my second home. My wife says it's my first, but I do enjoy the marshes. Peaceful, different world out here.
There aren't many other places where Eric Edwards could carry on his craft. He's been harvesting reeds for more than 30 years, but he may be the last full-time cutter left in the Broads.
Years ago I was coming on an old bike. I've got a van now, but just get in my little boat, come across the river, and from reed cutting, I mean you cut reed through the winter. Then you start in sort of December, middle of December, and you stop cutting reed about middle of April. Well, I'd go to the reed bed and start the cutting with the scythe. You can't cut reed until the leaf comes off. You want a good old wind frost. That'll take the leaf off. I think when you come onto a marsh, it's a different kind of world. You've got everything around you. You've got the wildlife around you. You see the obvious things like the moorhens, and you see marsh harriers at times, and you see the kingfisher occasionally. And when you're actually reed cutting, I always say the most prettiest bird on the marsh is the bearded tits. They're gorgeous, and they generally know when you're there. As soon as you start working, they start to forage along the edge of the reed, and they are gorgeous birds.
Another celebrated Broadland animal was an explorer in a new land itself, the Coypu. a large but friendly creature from South America.
The Coypu bears a valuable fur known commercially as nutria. In the years before the war, nutria was as highly esteemed by women as mink is today. To meet the demand, Coypu were imported to England in 1929 and bred here on fur farms.
The aim was to produce homegrown nutria, and when a few of the animals escaped, nobody was very worried. These foreigners would never survive a Norfolk winter in the wild. But they took to the Broads like, well, water rats to water.
Farmers had lived with Coypu from 1935 onwards, and they had seen how they had multiplied. And farmers, I mean, had their own little war against the Coypu by shooting and whatnot. And they were of the opinion that you could never eradicate Coypu. The amazing thing was, when Coypu first came about, farmers, oh, they were happy about it because they were keeping the dikes clean, clearing all the vegetation. It was saving them a job. Until they started attacking their crops, well, that was a different story.
We used to get huge Coypus here, almost as big as my Labrador almost, it seemed like it. And they were very gentle creatures. They had these big yellow fangs, but they looked fierce, but they weren't fierce at all, and they're vegetarians.
The largest one I ever shot was a 19 3/4 pound Coypu. It set me thinking, because I'd heard these old marshmen talking about this great old 35-pounders, boy, you know, and I thought, well, I'll issue a reward for any Coypu over 22 pounds. Alec Bablock, the landlord of the pub called the Stracy Arms. Alex rang up and said, one of the old marshmen had got a Coypu there, which weighed 22 pounds. And I said, hold him there and I'll come over and give him 6 quid. And I went along to Stracy, and in the back room of the pub there was this Coypu on the scales with 22 pound on it, exact. And I was about to give the old blighter his 6 pound, and I picked the Coypu up by his tail, and I said, there you are, Yiken, you've got a very good Coypu here. And as I shook it, a big stone dropped out of its mouth. They'll take your leg up as soon as look at you, these marshmen round here. They're great ones for practical jokes. Still, I bought him a beer instead.
The teeming wetlands of the Broads have been fertile breeding grounds for naturalists too. Percy Trett was first guided round the marshes by his grandfather, who in turn was a friend of Arthur Patterson from Great Yarmouth. Patterson wrote some of the first great accounts of Norfolk wildlife under the name of John No-Little, but he knew a lot and taught much of it to Ted Ellis. Ted was known as the people's naturalist and was the acknowledged authority on the natural history of the Broads. After the war, he bought and lived at Wheatfen Broad in the extreme west of Broadland. Sadly, he died in 1986, but his widow Phyllis still lives there.
Oh, I just thought it was the one place in the world where I wanted to live. And we went out on the water in the old litter boat, now defunct, and saw all this beautiful clean water and no disturbance, no motorboats, and plants and birds singing. As soon as I saw it in 1936, I thought this is where I'd like to live. I had, of course, visited Wheatfen with Ted, but it wasn't until we lived here that I realised quite what a paradise it was, with winding waterways and pools and birds and plants. And as the summer progressed, so the place grew ever more wonderful to me. The meadow-like marshes, or as they call them here, the litter marshes, had so many different flowers, orchids, meadow rue, meadow sweet. All sorts of flowers were blooming in amongst the hay.
And some hay it was, scented with water mint and bog myrtle and the nectar of myriads of flowers. It was the cutting of hay and of other semi-wild crops like reed, sedge and willow for thatching and basket making that kept open Broadland's patchwork of water and fen.
You have to rake it all out, you have to dress it with a rake and a little comb. Everything's done by hand. Normally you have to be dressed out and trounced down onto a board, a trouncing board, tied up and put onto the boat. But it has to be all cleaned out, all the old grass and rubbish have to come out of the bunch and tied into bundles. There'd probably be more people working the marshes years ago. You'd have seen more marshmen here. When I come here, there's 3 of us. I still have a affection for the old boys of years ago with the old side. I mean, I was taught for a good craftsman. They taught you the right kind of way, and it lived with you for the rest of your life, I think. Pride of work, and I think in life that means a lot. Generally, if you got some reed in the marsh, you carry it over hand to a boat, and then punt it out to the stave, or you have a reed lighter and take it by reed lighter.
There were wherries still trading on the Broad when I came here, admittedly only a few, but they still conjure up vivid memories. These great big black sails lumbering across the marshes. And I must have stored this memory in my mind because quite often I paint these scenes now.
Wherries, the Broad's all-purpose workhorses, almost grew out of the landscape. Their tall sails could catch the wind over the highest reed beds and waft the boats down the narrow channels as elegantly as swans.
On the front of the wherry was always a white patch, because they used to travel sometimes in the dusk and the gloaming, and this white patch would warn other boats that they were coming. You could see it. It was quite startling. Each wherry and each skipper had his own a little wind vane, which is known as a Jenny Morgan. You'd be able to tell which wherry was coming down, not only by the skipper's Jenny Morgan, but the colour banding on the top of the mast, which denoted the owners. Grandfather had 2 wherries which he used to ply from Stokesby to Yarmouth. They take corn and flour down to the town and bring back coal and merchandise back to the villages, because the wherries were like the lorries for this area.
Cornwall, part of the Celtic tribe land that stretches right down the rocky coasts of Western Europe, has its own native boats too.
That's an old-fashioned lugger. That's one of the old luggers. Years ago, that's all they do. They used to sail. They had no engine. I think my father was one of the first to have engine in the loo. He had a boat with a Progress, similar to this boat here.
The Cornish lugger was perfectly suited to tight, rugged havens and is almost identical to the Chasse Maree of Brittany.
I had a mate of mine called Pengelly, Peter Pengelly. His father was called Burke. He had a boat called the Blossom, and we used to go to school together, and we'd call for one another, like, you know. And if the pilchard boats were inland, we'd always aboard the boat, so we was probably born in boats, really. And I know we used to go to school full of pilchard scales on our shoes, like, you know. We used to be told off by the headmaster.
The warm Gulf Stream waters have always tempted strange creatures towards the Cornish coast. There's a local legend that Cornwall's countless saints came here on the back of dolphins.
We just set out to find out everything we could about cetaceans, whales, dolphins and porpoises in Cornwall. And we've now been doing this sea watch here for more than 3 years on a regular basis. There were lots of fascinating anecdotes. I mean, the most astonishing really was an old chap who remembered a place where bottlenose dolphins used to drive mackerel into a very shallow muddy bay called Who Lake, and they'd then wait until the tide went out, so it'd be sort of running solid mackerel through the stream coming out, and the dolphins would just munch their way through them. Common dolphins are very much a Cornish animal. More than half the strandings in the UK actually occur in Cornwall. And we now know that there are more of them around in the winter in these waters here, and in the summer they go right out to the edge of the continental shelf.
There are aerial predators on these coasts too. Peregrine falcons, more usually thought of as upland birds, nest on the cliffs. They're a swashbuckling breed down here, hunting sometimes only feet above the sea. But during the war, they were regarded more as pirates and virtually driven into extinction.
A calm, moonlit night. Everything ready and waiting, from planes to carrier pigeons. They seem to know the ops are on. Come on, fellas, get cracking.
The first peregrine falcons I ever saw were captive birds, which the RAF falconers had got on the Cornish coast, and they were on a little lay-by up on the Zena Road, and they were taking them around to farmers and the towns, showing people what they were, so that, in fact, they could be shot. And they were afraid that the peregrine falcons would catch the pigeons which were released from aircraft which had been shot down during the war. I mean, whether it was valid or not, I don't know, but that's what they were doing. And they wiped the peregrine falcon out.
No, the first peregrine I ever saw was up at Morinstow. I had not found one of my own, and I climbed to the top of Morinstow at Hennicliff, and I looked over the cliff, and looked down below, and there was a peregrine on a pinnacle below me, and it just looked up and cackled and went right out to sea. The first kill I saw, and it's etched in my memory and always will be, I was sitting on this spur and some pigeons came past me, turned and went up the valley at Morinstow. And I thought, well, that's it. No, but nothing is interesting. The next minute, they came hurtling down this sort of valley, swung right over my head. And as they swung over my head, a peregrine came straight down in behind them, out of the sun, and lifted one out of a flock of about 20, and lifted it right out clean. And the feathers actually drifted down over my head. And I was so elated, I jumped up and grabbed some of the feathers as they floated down.
Peregrines have returned to breed in Cornwall, as they have to almost all their traditional sites. They still take the odd racing pigeon, but their main diet is seabirds. So, like almost everything else that lives on the coast, their survival depends ultimately on the health and abundance of the fish stocks.
This is a Cornish pilchard. It's really a fully grown sardine, 4 or 5 years old. For centuries, the pilchard fishery has been the mainstay of Cornwall. Long before the last war, the pilchard fishery was on the decline, and this in its turn had its effect on the Cornish fishermen.
Well, the pilchard fishing was the main industry of Cornwall, one of the main industries, more than mine and tending. But before the war, the pilchard boats used to go out from Lou in Coypu, Navigazine, and places like that. We never had no echo sounders or nothing like that. The only thing we had on the boat was a compass, and I started with my father. And you rely on the birds, the gannets. And the old fishermen could prove that 9 times out of 10 the fish be going towards the wind. By the work on the gannet, they watch the birds, you know.
There was something in common, too, between the pilchard netters and the other hunting animals of the Cornish coast. Peregrine, dolphin and fisherman all relied on the ancestral hunting skills of driving their prey into a corner. And as for the gannets, they had an almost symbiotic bond with the fishermen. The birds guiding the boats towards the shoals, then feeding off the fish boiling round the nets. No wonder the gannet's name in Cornish, Zether, the arrow, has a mite of respect as well as vivid description in it.
What they used to do, they would put the pilchards in pits and cure them in salt. And then, after they've been in the pits and cured in salt, they put them in the wooden barrels. My mother's job was the top row of the fish was made as a flour. And when they took the lid off the barrel, you had to look a flour. Then the pilchards were transported or shipped to Italy.
The changing tastes of the Italians, combined with dwindling shoals, led to the collapse of Cornish pilchard fishing. So the coastlanders went in search of new prey, and what they found were sharks and shoals of tourists, and if they were lucky, the two together. Commercial big game fishing came to southwest England. It wasn't to be one of the more edifying episodes in Cornwall's recent history.
I started shark fishing myself in the middle 50s. But as far as I've been told and remember, there was a Brigadier Conter. Now he was a well-liked and well-known person here. Well, he was with Montgomery, as a matter of fact. Brigadier Conter tried to catch one on a rod. That's how it started. It was easier work, I'll be honest with you. You had your nights in from sea for a start. And it was a change. You had a change of life, in a sense. You had an easier life. You was looking after people, and they was all right, you know, it was all right then. You went out to sea all night long, and you know, and plus the fact your wife knowed your hours. You went out to sea in the morning, and you was back in 5 o'clock.
It looks sadly as if the lesson of the pilchard decline just hasn't been learnt. Sharks too are being fished out. There are less species seen here, less overall numbers, and barely a big fish, a trophy fish, left at all.
Now all the shark fishermen in the Lough are trying to preserve the fishing industry in the shark world. They release as many sharks as humanly possible. We don't take them in at all if we can help it, not the skipper.
On the Broadland waters, things were changing too.
I was married in '38, and the last holiday I had with my parents sailing, by which time they got a proper cabin boat, was in 1938. In the early days, it was lovely. It was peaceful and quiet. It was the clearness of the water, the clarity. When one was sailing, you washed up over the side of the dike because it was clean. Especially if you went up to Erstead, you could almost drink the water up there. We didn't, but you could have done. I would have done.
60 years on, Phyllis still enjoys sailing and still has her memories.
On the marshes. They used to come over from Ireland, you know, and be sold in the market.
The windmills of Norfolk, I suppose, in one simple picture, evoke memories of the Broads. People look at the windmill and they immediately think of the Norfolk Broads. My first memories of the mills were of rather derelict mills because the sails had fallen to pieces and they were rather like skeletons, I suppose, silhouetted against the Norfolk sky. In some cases the mills have been restored, but somehow they looked even better when they were in a semi-derelict state.
When I first come down here, there were 6 windmills, and they all pumped into the Halvergate Fleet, which we now come alongside on, you saw. Well, they used to lift the water up and push it into the fleet, and the fleet used to go to right away to Brighton, which is 5 miles away, and the sluice doors used to open with the tides and let the water out, so the marshes didn't get flooded. You see? They call them wind pumps, we used to call them windmills, but there's no difference.
I can remember Halvergate when it was still being drained in a traditional way, but by the windmills. If you stood by Burney High Mill, then there'd be a great cascade of foamy water coming out of it. If there were periods of heavy rain in the winter and there was no wind so that the windmills were unable to work, then within a few days the dike level would increase, and before you knew where you were, there'd be this most marvellous shallow lagoons and pools on the marshes, which attracted literally hundreds and hundreds of pink-footed and white-fronted geese.
During the day, they would fly in from Scrooby Island, which lies 2.5 miles out at sea. They'd fly in over the town, skein after skein of them, all clamouring and shouting. The town used to stop. People would stop and look up and watch the geese fly in at dawn and out at dusk.
And then, gradually, the magic began to seep away. Diesel pumps were introduced, and for the first time it became possible to drain the marshes even when there was no wind. The silver meadows, shimmering with wildfowl in winter, began to be replaced by reseeded pastures and docile cattle. And as the reed beds began to dry out, so the bitterns began to disappear.
We watched a male bittern bowman, and what he did, his body was upright like that, leant his head down, and his neck up like that, and it boom, and it was a marvellous sound.
The bittern, known here as the night raven, was at the heart of Broadland folklore. One local story was that it boomed by pushing its bill into a reed and blowing it like a trumpet. The first survey of Broadland bitterns in 1955 was organised by the Norfolk ornithologist Michael Seago. By gathering together information and sightings from keepers and marshmen, he established that the population included some 55 booming males. Both the males and the silent females are very secretive, and the males notoriously polygamous. But by 1970, numbers of boomers halved, and by 1994 were down to just 2. The drastic decline of the bittern, one of the region's most ancient citizens, was another sign that the whole Broadland ecosystem was beginning to deteriorate. Before the war, the Broads was an idyllic waterscape, the South Seas of eastern England, and a place where real children echoed the adventures of Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazons gangs.
Across the marsh is the ford. We could walk there from the house without very much trouble and take the family swimming. When they went to school, they invited their friends, and we used to have parties of 20 odd there swimming and enjoying ourselves.
But then the Broadland waters began to cloud. Reed beds died back. Whole species vanished. At first it was thought that phosphates from detergents were the main cause of the trouble, fertilizing the algae so much that it blanketed out other aquatic plants. But it soon became clear that nitrate fertilizer washed out of Norfolk's farmland was the main culprit, and the process of water deterioration was nightmarishly complex. Sewage, overflowing farm slurry pits, silt stirred up by motor cruisers, all played a part. It was a vicious circle. The faster the algae grew, the more oxygen it took up, and the more turbid the water became. Pike and pondweeds alike were suffocated, and the death of the fish had impacts higher up the food chain.
Ospreys are one of the features, particularly in May and again in late August and early September. They would stay for days, even weeks, and then they would catch fish in the Broad. He would spot a fish and then he would dive into the water, completely disappear, and we had this marvellous shower of spray, and he'd then catch the fish, one put in front of the other, and struggle with it. It would be a great shudder to clear his plumes of water, and then off he would go into the nearest wood. In those days, ospreys would be here for days, even weeks, but now, because of the cloudiness of the water, they're unable to see to fish, so they merely pass through. They might stay for half an hour, but that's all.
Beneath the surface, the Cornish coastal waters have the luxuriance of a coral reef. Down below the forests of kelp, seals swim through tenements of sponge and coral, and among creatures with names out of a book of fairy tales, jewel anemones, sea fans. This is the delicate ground base of the whole coastal ecosystem, where shrimps graze and the small fish feed.
This is a set of mackerel feathers that we use for catching mackerel. It's got a lead on the bottom. You put the lead over the side, and then you've got your feathers in a long string. We first started using these feathers just after the Second World War. Some of the Cornish fishermen were stationed in Scotland in the Navy, and they saw the Scots using them. And some of the Scottish fishermen who were down here stationed brought them down with them. And we found them very, very efficient for catching mackerel. And of course we've used them ever since. All they are is a coloured chicken feather on a hook. And when they're in the water they open and close like that and look like little small fish or squid or something.
It's idyllic, almost subtropical here. Yet along these coasts there's a persistent sense of danger. It comes both on the coast and inland from the crush of the outside world on a settled society. The old rhythm is disrupted by new technologies that have no sensitivity to place at all. No one knows what the tide will bring in or wash up. It could be charming, bewitching, sinister, from a pith helmet to a discarded packet of medical waste. But increasingly, it was the old legend of Cornwall as a wrecker's coast that came back to haunt it with a new twist. Swimmers and surfers began to struggle through a swelling tide of sewage. Dolphins were drowned in fishermen's nets. And in 1967, Cornwall became the hapless victim of the first major oil tanker to break up in British waters.
When dawn broke this morning over this reef 7 miles from the Isles of Scilly, the Torrey Canyon was seen to be in a worse position than at nightfall. Throughout the night she'd been rolling and pounding on the Seven-Stones rocks, and as the wind freshened this morning she was slipping slowly but perceptibly deeper in the water.
What I knew about it was the smell of oil. All that way. She was maybe, what, 5 miles offshore, and the wind was blowing in. Over to Port 11 where I was working, I could smell the oil. Came all around this coast, all around here. Dreadful. The immediate effect on wild birds was to get covered in oil, and they probably died. But there was a few hundred. But the long-term effect was caused by the detergent. This beach here, you just see just here, this Portmere beach, the oil came in on this beach. It was black. And they went down there, they had the army, 2 or 3 fire brigades, people with brushes and scrubbing brushes and detergent, and they covered it in detergent. It was plastered in detergent. The bay and all this coastline had so much detergent in it that it killed everything, and I mean everything. All the shellfish, the crabs, the seaweeds, mussels, cockles, limpets, all gone, nothing. And that summer, the first colonizers of a rock in the sea are green seaweeds. And the whole coastline was brilliant emerald green with seaweed, because there was no grazing animals there. There was no shellfish to eat it, not a thing, not a mussel, nothing. And it took years for it to get back.
Sometimes trouble does come in such calamitous events, but it can also steal up on you in quiet corners, as one incomer in search of the Cornish idyll discovered 20 years ago.
This valley is typical of those of North Cornwall, a short, steep-sided little valley with a stream running along the bottom, running down to the sea, right down to the Atlantic. And to come here early in the morning, first thing, when the dew's on the grass, and it's all quiet, it's all fresh, and the sounds of all the roads and the traffic, you can't hear any of that down here. You come down and you just look at it and you're in the midst of nature. A bumblebee will come out. As it gets a bit warmer, it will buzz around and you think, this is the place where the large blue butterfly is to be found. It's too cold yet, it's not warm enough for it to come. So you sit patiently watching it, absorbing the beauty all around you. And you look around and suddenly you think, there's some butterflies around, and is that a large blue? No sign of one yet. Then out of the corner of the eye you see a different fluttering, a different movement. And your attention is at once grabbed. You look at it and think, I believe that is a large blue butterfly. You look closer. Yes, it is. Your instincts are aroused, a sort of hunter's instincts. And you follow it as it goes out of the gorse onto a wild thyme plant which starts to feed. You suddenly see the blue of its wings against the blue of the Atlantic in the green sides of the valley, in this short little valley with the sea at the end, the blue of the wings complementing the blue of the sea, and you think, this is a unique butterfly. This is the large blue butterfly.
The large blue's complex life cycle relies during one of its phases on short cropped grass, which was widespread when there were sheep still grazing the cliff tops. Now you're more likely to see walkers following the coastal paths and grazing flocks, and butterfly lovers though they doubtless are, they don't wear down the grass in a way that suits the large blue.
Here, 20 years ago, was just one butterfly spotted. One, that's all. And then, after that, nothing at all. It had gone. It had left this valley after hundreds of years.
After the war, it started to go wrong. I think people had increased leisure. The Broads became a little bit overpopularised. It brought about an increase of huge motorised cruises.
Pleasure cruising is now far and away the dominant activity in the Broads. It's what pulls in the money and what gives a much wider range of people the chance to explore Broadland by water. But the boats have brought problems in their wake, quite literally. Even at the low speeds enforced here, their wash stirs up mud from the bottom and nibbles insidiously away at the banks. The power boaters weren't the only mammals to be damaging the banks. Those Coypu were also on the move. Coypu are mild-tempered, affectionate, cuddly animals, but they have huge appetites and multiply prodigiously. The Ministry of Agriculture suggested that there were 200,000 in Broadland at the beginning of the 1960s, that their population was increasing sixfold every year and would soon hit 3.5 million. But this was ministry propaganda, backed by an illustration of a Coypu that was like a monster from a medieval bestiary. Independent biologists' figures have shown that the maximum figure was more like 70,000.
The marshes smelt of Coypu, and in the evenings you'd hear them. They had such doleful cries. Whoa, whoa, mournful.
This is a use for Coypu that few people know about.
It's superior to hare. It's possibly on a par, maybe even slightly above veal. And of course it's far better than rabbit.
Well, of course we ate Coypu. Don't send good food down the drain. Didn't taste very different from rabbit or hare. Very good food. Bit of a nuisance to prepare. You fry it, or stew it, or do whatever you do, or bake it. I didn't bake it. I preferred to fry it with onions and apples and herbs, and then casserole it.
Coypu trappers remain convinced that it was the huge bonuses they were paid that made the campaign to eradicate the Coypu so successful. And it is the only naturalised exotic mammal ever to have been completely wiped out in this country.
I hold a bit sorry for the Coypu, actually, the way it had to be eradicated like that, because they were gentle creatures, but they were a bit of a pest.
I share Keith MacDougall's sense of sadness about the Coypu's demise, and cherish a faint hope that a small, well-behaved colony continue to sport in a remote creek. The Coypu's rise and fall is a parable of the changing fortunes of all Broadland. A wild place invaded by strangers, and then the whole lot tamed and sanitised.
I do miss the quietness and the seeing of the rarities up there. They've gone, and that's a sad part to me, and I feel sorry about that. And of course you miss the old people, you know, the characters, the marshmen and such like. They seem to have gone. The marsh houses used to support families. They are no longer occupied.
The social makeup of the Cornish fishing villages has changed dramatically too.
My parents are still living, they're 83, and they live in a terrace of houses that there are only 3 residents in it, and the rest of them are holiday lets, and that's a row of 16 houses, and it has actually killed the community.
The social structure's completely changed from when I was a child. Well, I miss the activity down in this part of the village, because apart from, as you see it today, this is the high season, and all the holiday makers are here. For the rest of the year, it's an absolutely deserted part of the village. In those days, you'd have seen dozens of crab pots. You'd have had nets all strung along here, drying, but you also got the smell of the fish.
Here we are, we've got in a shoal now, we started to catch a few. The faster we can unhook them, the faster we'll catch them. This is an unusual one for you. This is a weaver fish. It's one of the very few poisonous fish that we catch on those spines on his back there are poisonous. He's also got a sharp spine on his gills. But they say that the poison in them is the same as an adder. It does really make you very ill if you do get hooked up with them. They're usually kept locally as a delicacy.
Mackerel are one of the Cornish harvests for which demand is increasing, thanks to the current popularity of smoked mackerel in metropolitan restaurants and supermarkets. It would be nice to think they reminded people of Cornwall. But of course, it's just another example of how life in the countryside is unwittingly shaped by things that happen hundreds of miles away.
My grandfather was fishing from Pemberth. My father was fishing from Pemberth. I fished all my life from Pemberth. And it's in my blood. I don't think I could do anything else. I just love fishing.
Probably my strangest memory is going back, having been out here and going back on the train and in through the suburbs and everything was all hugger-mugger, all close together, you know. One felt very restricted when you went back.
Cornwall's coast still has its hidden coves and headlands, and thanks to the mackerel, a few people will continue to earn a living from fishing in the old way. But its collision with the modern world has been sharper than perhaps anywhere else in Britain. Cornwall is too seductive for its own good, and it seems as if there are just too many suitors for such an intimate and sensitive landscape. The same could be said of the Broads, but I'm more optimistic myself. Broadland now has the same kind of status and protection as a national park, and tourist money is helping to clear up the worst excesses of pollution. Many Broadland crafts are reviving, and reed is coming back into fashion for thatching. I think we still have a nostalgic belief in our countryside's history, and maybe in the work ethic, that makes us uncomfortable about rural places managed purely for pleasure. Yet why shouldn't wild places exist for our recreation and inspiration? We could, if we wanted to, dig another set of Broads, just like the peat miners did 7 centuries ago.
People see it as a romantic job, but it's hard graft really to be a reed cutter, especially in the winter time when you get wind, frost, snow, ice. I've got a couple of grandchildren that I shall show them the job, but whether they'll ever do it, I don't know.
There's nowhere else like it. I mean, you can travel all over the world, but you'll never find anything like the Norfolk Broads.